Dear colleagues, I'm very pleased to be here and have an opportunity to present our recent data obtained in very productive and fruitful collaboration between our institution and the colleagues from St. Petersburg University. So, and that was the study about an issue probably most of all know a lot about this issue. This is an issue about the very long discussion between so-called dual system proponents of so-called dual system approach and the single system approach to how to understand inflectional morphology. And for example, the dual system approach, the subject of the discussion is about how many processes are involved in the processing of regular forms. For example, so dual system approach proponents think that there are some special mechanism for regular form processing and another for the irregular ones. But for example, from single system approach, there are no such distinction between those processes. So, of course, up to date, there are a lot of behavioral and neuroimaging studies about this subject. So, but still, there is quite a lot of discussion about this issue. But probably the reason of the discussion is that almost all studies were performed with the English and German languages, but probably the lack of some studies devoted to study complex languages with complex morphology. So, and we try to fill this gap and to try to take Russian language and to study how these forms are produced. And for example, if we depart from dual system approach, we can formulate some quite testable predictions. For example, which assumes that, for example, the left fronto-temporal brain network would be associated with regular form production, and on the other hand, regular forms would be associated with so-called memory-based processes. So that is the very brief description of Russian verb morphology. And just for purposes of present study, we took the classification of Jakobson. And we selected two poles of this verb system. So one was that so-called I class, and another is and also this I class is the most frequent and productive, and another class is least frequent and non-productive. Here's just an examples, and what also I have to say is that regular I class exhibits some sort of default properties. So, for example, in terms of oral regularization. So we took these examples to the fMRI study, and here is the list of stimuli that we used. And in addition to verbs, we also presented nouns and pseudo-verbs derived from all verbs and nouns. So, and also I have to say that there is the minor irregularity of nouns, since if you want to produce a regular form of noun, you have to drop the vowel. So all things about balancing was done in terms of length, syllable structure, and word frequency, and the experimental task was to produce aloud the present tense form for verbs and the nominal form, numerous form from nouns. Plural form, sorry. A little bit of Russian here. So another thing is that we recorded oral respondents while scanning, so we had an opportunity to know exactly what is going on inside camera. So that is why, for example, our recording was without silent gaps. So that was the visual presentation, and so we can see the quite simple design, some sort of fMRI magic in terms of jittering interstimulus interval, and etc., etc. So, and 21 right-handed subjects were participating in the study. So here is of course, all the steps were quite standard. And I mean that how we process the fMRI data. So what we concentrated on is that we try to compare, and in the frames of factorial design, we try to compare regular verbs and non-verbs versus irregular ones. And we call this regularity factor. And another factor was the lexicality, where words were compared with non-words. So the same sort of analysis was applied to nouns, but we didn't combine it all together. You're welcome. So because the irregularity for verbs not equals to irregularity of nouns. So here is the nice picture of what we acquired. What we obtained. So here is the brain areas which is sensitive to manipulation of regularity. And that's all it calls, and statistically it calls main effect of regularity. So practically the same pattern was observed for the lexicality effect, and there was no interaction between lexicality and regularity. So if you look at some bars denoting the level of functional activity in those areas. So I just want us to say that the first bar is for the regular verbs, the second one, just the same. The second one is for irregular, the third one is for regular nonce verb, and finally the fourth one is for irregular nonce verb. So from these bars, we can conclude that actually those activations are more sensitive to irregular verb production. So the regular verbs were characterized by great activity in those areas. But for example, for me, as for neurophysiologist, this picture, when I look at these pictures, the first thing that came to my mind that there is the cognitive control network, which is not exactly how to say, related to the language process itself. So we try to figure out what is going on with our data, and thought in terms of cognitive control of cognitive demands. So we try to model the just gradual increase in the processor load from regular verbs to irregular, from regular nonce verbs to irregular, and we constructed so-called parametric contrast modeling this increase in processing load. So only calculated both for verbs and nouns. So if you look at the data, look at these locations of activity, it's quite the same. They significantly overlap. So we just interpret this data like the actually quite universal phenomenon. Doesn't matter with it verbs and nouns. So indeed, it's quite corresponding to what we see, what we saw with the number of mistakes. So it was quite similar also to nouns. So and finally, if we turn to verbs again, we try to calculate the overlap between areas responsible for regularity, sensitive to main effect of regularity, and sensitive to this increase in load. So here is the. It's not very good. Okay, so it's the aim of this slide is to show that they are still significantly overlapping. So taking into account this data, we just thought that indeed what do we see is just the cognitive control, the cognitive load actually, how to say, tagged to the irregularity effect here. So it's probably this very good explanation for our data, but indeed when they're trying to understand how brain works, we think in terms of how different brain system or how different brain areas are interact one with each other. But it is practically impossible to judge about these processes only looking at the level of activity. That is why we try to find the method which would allow us to analyze how this functional interaction occurs, what is behind those findings. So when there are some methods which allows you to analyze the functional connectivity, so the connectivity between brain areas involved in some tasks. So and here is one such example, is that this is the analysis of psychophysiological interaction, so-called also the PPI analysis. So what it allows you to get is that it allows you to reveal how your experimental task influence interaction between brain areas. So you are getting statistical measure, the dependence between two brain areas as a function of the change of your experimental task. So here is the very brief description of this method. So this is actually an example of so-called generalized PPI, but at its basis it is actually the same as standard PPI with minor difference. So what you're getting, you're just just selecting the region of interest. For example, if you have the strong hypothesis, or you have the some previously performed subtractive analysis. So the pick up the activity in this region, and you to try to mathematically estimate what kind of neuronal activity causes this change in bold activity. It could be found here. Further, what you have different tasks. For example, condition 1 and condition 2. And the next step, what you're trying to do is just to understand what kind of neuronal activity is locked to a particular condition, and you use this information in order to create so-called PPI regressor. In the next step, what you're doing is just you picking, for example, voxel from the rest of the brain, or just another region of interest, and to try to calculate the parameter which would describe the impact of particular PPI regressor, which finally gives you information about how neuronal activity locked to the particular condition influence the resulted activity. So that is the measure about how brain areas functionally connected with particular region of interest. So unfortunately, there is only one, to the best of my knowledge, only one such study which uses PPI and the irregular verb processes. So, but we're lucky to have some co-author of this work here. Right. So the main finding of that study was that the regular verb processing was led to increase in association between the fronto-temporal brain network and the anterior cingulate cortex. So this is taking into account these findings, in our subtractive analysis, we try to analyze our data and understand how regular and irregular verb production influence this connectivity. So what actually we do, we pick, we choose one cluster in inferior frontal gyrus from our subtractive analysis, and find the local maxima. In this cluster, put there the region of the sphere, and they choose it like the region of interest. And we performed the whole brain analysis for just real regular and irregular verbs, and the same analysis was performed for irregular ones, nonce ones. Here is the brief description of our findings. Just if we look, for example, at the subtractive analysis table, so great activity was, in comparison with those findings, the great activity was associated with the regular verbs, but we've shown that actually the irregular verbs leads to increase in functional activity within the inferior frontal gyrus. But that was paradoxically for us that we were observed actually the same direction of findings. So the regular verbs in our case lead to increase in functional connectivity in the fronto-temporal brain network, regardless of stimuli domain and experimental task. But our data also add some additional information to that study, and this additional information is about that the functional connectivity I want to say extends to bilateral network. So we can see that the both sides of temporal network are functionally connected with inferior frontal gyrus as a function of regular verb production. So the bars here is also shows the size of effect. So and finally, let's just concluding remarks is that probably the regular forms processing are not so heavily relied on left frontotemporal network, and particularly for Russian language it's quite also important to have frontal lobe connected to bilateral temporal cortex. Thank you very much.
We have 10 minutes for questions, please.
No, I'm going to ask. I'm sorry if I missed this, but perhaps one of the differences between English and Russian is what is irregularity? What in different languages is it the same thing for Russian verbs? I missed if you have a description of Russian verb stimuli. What do you define as irregular?
So thank you for your question. So so if I'm just would be wrong, you can just repeat it. Continue. So under irregular we mean the non-productive class. No?
No, not quite. So
not quite. Okay.
I'm the linguist co-author of the paper, so let me maybe answer the question. So, of course, like in Russian, we have something like, it depends on the system, but something like, say, 11 different verb classes. So we, in this study, we took the two poles, so the most frequent and productive I class, and the least frequent non-productive class that has like a number of verbs with very infrequent inflectional patterns. Yeah. Like клясть, кляну, класть, кладу, лгать, лгу, and so on and so forth.
But there is a striking difference with this and in the English irregular. It's not the same as...
Sure.
It's a whole different level of irregularity. English and Russian ones are still maintaining inflectional endings in the suffixes and everything, which could potentially explain the difference.
So I guess, just a second, could you go back to this table where we summarized the results? So I guess the most kind of surprising finding, as far as I can judge, could you stop here, is that we got different results in our subtractive analysis, but still the kind of very similar results in our PPI analysis. So, of course, there are not only the differences in regularity, irregularity between English and Russian. We also used different tasks. So in this study that was the subtractive analysis was reported in Tyler et al. And the PPI analysis in Stamatakis and colleagues, they also used different tasks in auditory modality, and this was a phonological similarity judgment. So of course the tasks are different, so this kind of difference can potentially be explained by that, but it's extremely striking that the PPI results were absolutely the same, and although we didn't find any regularity effect in the subtractive analysis, I mean just regularity, not processing difficulty stuff, here regular verbs showed more connectivity between, yeah.
That makes sense. Actually, two different things, connectivity and activity, it's not the same.
Yeah, it's not the same, but... Mm-hmm. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, sorry, I'm done.
Hi, thanks for the talk. Could you go back to the slide where you define the contrasts for where you talk about main effective regularity and so the red
first
and
one.
green?
This one?
No, where you explicitly mention the contrast. Oh, that one. So for the first one, you say, which is denoted by red.
Yes.
Basically, you're subtracting each baseline corrected condition from the irregular nonce verbs.
So the first, yes.
And you call that the main effective regularity?
No. There is the parametric contrast, modeling the increase from regular verb, irregular verb, nonce verb. Here is the main effect of regularity.
Because later on, if you go further, you mention red is regularity and green is processing load.
Yes, here it is.
And, but that doesn't have anything to do with the previous slide.
So the previous slide shows you the overlap between the cognitive load for nouns and for verbs, but
so this
slide is quite the same.
This red and green is different from...
Yeah.
Oh.
Okay. That is why it's just always writing some notations.
Yeah, but maybe you don't see that because, the table obscures.
It's legend.
And with the main effective regularity, do you mean an F contrast?
Yes.
Or, okay.
Yes,
so
F contrast.
You didn't look in the two directions with T contrasts?
No, because of multiple comparison problems. So we did it only in factorial design. And actually, we, in order to reveal where is the increase or decrease, we masked by the T-map, so how it is implemented in SPM. So and also the bars shows you in effect calculated and just average betas in each cluster for each condition.
Yeah.
It's a little bit confusing for you.
Well, yeah, I'm not used to this kind of approach. Also, the contrast where you extract every other condition from one condition, I mean, it's not a main effect, it's not an interaction. I'm not sure why you use this.
Well, it's quite common, this conventional approach. So what you're doing, you're just acquiring the betas for every condition compared with baseline, and in the second level, you just do this some sort of factorial design and calculate the...
But in a factorial design, you would have main effects and interactions, but it's neither of those.
No, that we have main effects here. Here is the main effect.
But I mean this contrast where you subtract every other condition from one condition. It's not an interaction. It's not a main effect. So how does it fit into a full factorial
Why not main effect? Main effect in terms of second level analysis. Just you're just acquiring the difference between the experimental task and the control in the first level. For example, you have 4 tasks and just provide it to second level analysis, and just you use the beta map, contrasts, and follow it in the second level. And you can do, for example, just one sample DDS, or just you can analyze it in the factorial design. Doesn't matter. What's the question?
I'm so sorry, we have other questions lined up.
Yeah, we'll have to talk about it later because I don't understand your...
It's quite a standard thing.
There was another question from over there. Yes.
Very nice, clear presentation. Obviously very different results than the ones that Tyler and myself and others reported. But I think, first of all, I agree with Yuri that the notion of regularity. I mean, if I was a hardline dual model Pinker type, I would not recognize your regularity as being regularity because it doesn't, you know, the whole question about the default and so on and so forth. And in fact, I've been through all this in great detail with a Polish graduate student where we worked on elicitation of forms in Polish non-fluent aphasics, with very much the same, I think, questions that you had in mind, and where we found increases in error rate were not determined by whether the verbs came from an inflection class that we defined as being regular on the same grounds that you put, you know, chita and so forth, but whether stem change was involved. It seemed to be the cognitive control problems of stem change that were leading to problems, and they affected generating new inflections for both, generating forms of both regular and irregular. I think there's there are problems about regularity and irregularity. And this is one reason why it's so important to do these studies across different languages. I mean, the other thing, obviously, is that it's perception and production. And I have to say that the task we used, this is now 10, 12 years ago, is not a task that I would now use in a scanning experiment. This is where they heard pairs of words like play, played, or teach, taught, and were asked to say whether the second word was the same as the first word. Now, that involves all sorts of cognitive functions, which, you know, again, complicate the interpretation of this in terms of regularity and irregularity. I mean, the reason we use that task in the healthy participant study is because we previously used it with patients. And patients, left hemisphere patients, do have particular problems with making that pairwise choice between two repetitions or semi-repetitions when it involves a potential inflectional affix. So it is sensitive to that. But if you're looking at what the brain is doing, the brain is going to be sensitive to all sorts of other things. So I wouldn't want to draw too many conclusions from the differences in the pattern that you got and that we got. I think I'd hope that what we saw was valid in its context, and yours is valid in its context, but they're not answering the same questions in quite the same way. More work is needed by all of us.
We have a couple minutes for one quick question.
Yeah, I actually wanted to say in response to your question that for me the similarity in the PPI study was more striking than the difference in the subtractive analysis. Because then it points to the existence of some regularity that we do have in common in English and in Russian. Because when we got different results in the subtractive analysis, that was kind of more, more easy to understand than we finally got very similar results in the PPI study.
One quick addition to respond to you, Yuri. We called this effect the nesting doll effect for Russian verbs, with the first layer of affix stripping, which invokes a standard paradigm, and then things that are happening to the stem. So you're right, it's not an analysis.
It's a whole different level of complexity from
Exactly.
ET versus random.
Exactly. That's why we work with Russian and we know this method. Thank you very much.